Thank you so much for coming. I really didn't know what to expect today, so I'm very happy to see so many of you. Thank you to Martin Chautari and of course SAI and Mona Lisa for the nice introduction and for organizing this. I've been working on a paper actually at the South Asia Institute in Bergen for the last 2-3 months, and I'm gonna go back. I'll go back to Norway next week, so it's almost at the end of my time here. So it's really nice that we could still fit this in. The topic of today's seminar is kind of already revealed in the title. I will speak about the home gardening practices of Tibetan refugees in South India, specifically in Karnataka, and what these changes in people's gardens can tell us about larger social and environmental transitions in people's lives in exile. This work is largely based on fieldwork that I conducted in 2022 and 23 in one specific Tibetan settlement called Döndemling. It's in South Karnataka at the Tamil Nadu border. And I've since worked on developing or turning these insights that I got there into a journal article, which is it's almost done. I hope to submit in the next 2-3 weeks. So this is also a really good opportunity for me to get some final feedback before submission. So great timing all together. So I thought I would start with addressing how my interest in home gardens came about, because it is a somewhat niche topic, I guess, right? I should say that my initial focus of the PhD research was not on gardens. I'm actually part of a bigger research project at CMI, at the Institute in Bergen, and we focus on human-environment relations from all sorts of angles in prolonged displacement and exile situations, among others Tibetan displacement. And within the project, I have a specific focus on land and agriculture in South India and also Nepal. Today, just as a heads up, I will not be speaking about Nepal, but I can do that in the questions later on. During my first field visit in 2022, I spent most of my time actually conducting interviews with Tibetan farmers and Indian farmers, and to kind of understand the changing role of agriculture. And I would conduct these interviews mostly at people's houses, so I'd go to people's houses and sit down and have these conversations. And as I was visiting houses, up to 60, I would say, I was almost every single time very stunned by people's gardens. You see an example here in the picture. So this is not just a single exception. There are a lot of gardens that look very similar to this. There are all sorts of flowers, vegetables, fruits, self-made pots, just a lot of variety, which stunned me a little bit because I guess I just didn't expect to see such sophisticated cultivation and also these landscaping practices in rural Karnataka, in an area that is mainly covered by maize, as you see in the picture. This is a picture of Döndemling, of the Tibetan settlement. It is bordering a tiger reserve there by the hills, and it's 2 hours to the next town. So it's a very rural place. And then you have these diverse home gardens of people's. So I started adding a few questions to my regular agriculture-focused interviews about people's gardens. I was really just curious, I didn't have a bigger plan just yet. And then what I noticed was that the types of what types of plants people grow, and then for what purposes, and with what resources and inputs, had firstly significantly changed since the gardens were first established in the 1970s. And then also the more gardeners I spoke to, I also found reoccurring patterns and overlaps in these changes and different factors involved in these changes over the last 50 years. So I managed to squeeze in some garden tours, specific garden tours at the end of my first field. So walk me through the gardens, explain how they changed, how old certain plants were, where they got the seeds and saplings from. And in the end, these 5 tours that I conducted as kind of a pilot really ended up being these very rich and detailed conversations, not just about gardening, but about Tibetan life in exile as a whole and how people's lives and livelihoods have changed. over the past 50 years since they came to this specific settlement. So long story short, I then decided to make gardens one of my main focuses for the next fieldwork. And so the idea was to explore people's home gardens and gardening practices and their evolution over time and space, to understand what this reveals about their everyday lives and livelihoods of long-term refugees and their spatial temporal dynamics and transformations. This is also the aim of the article, so that's why it sounds very, very jargony. So basically, I wanted to use these home gardens as lenses of investigation into larger processes of change. So as I was preparing for the second field visit, I started exploring the literature and found that actually refugee and migrant gardening has seen quite a bit of academic interest in various fields, in anthropology, also ethnobotany, public health, geography, and all these fields study gardens as sites of diverse social and environmental action. So very different angles. Gardens have, for example, been understood as meeting places for both refugee communities, but also meeting places for refugees and host communities and foster new relationships. They have been understood as more therapeutic landscapes that support mental and physical well-being, especially after traumatic displacement journeys. They have also been understood as sites of food sovereignty and placemaking, that basically allowing refugees to preserve certain traditional food ways in exile, and also in these unfamiliar environments, and with that also add to certain placemaking processes. So this literature is really rich and interesting and has very different angles to this role of gardening in refugee settlement. But one thing that I noticed is that the presented cases usually focus on the outcomes of gardens. Like, what is the role for gardens to the refugee, their role as producers of harvests, of relationships, of knowledge. But as we know from other literature, which I'll get to in a minute, gardens are not just producers, but they're of course also products of various material, social, and societal processes, which include factors like people's beliefs, their values, knowledge and skills, their needs, their preferences, as well as much broader socio-economic, political and environmental factors. And there is a certain literature that has studied this interconnection between gardens and larger individual and societal processes, but not so much in the refugee context. This has much more been explored in rural home gardens and indigenous home garden situations in many parts of the world. Papers or existing research have focused on this interconnection between gardens and livelihoods, socio-economic conditions, agricultural practices, infrastructure, market access, demographics and family structures, social networks, environmental conditions, and also more politically mediated elements such as land tenure and access to resources. And how these are then linked to shifts in species diversity, gardening techniques, garden purposes, as well as functions. So together, these individual and social elements, they shape the garden space and purpose, and also the various outcomes. So initially, just before, I was talking about the outcomes that a lot of the refugee studies literature talks about. It's on this side. But I'm actually in this paper more interested in these external forces on the left side. And of course, there are interrelations, and it's not a one-directional relationship here. That's also what these various arrows indicate. So this is, in the paper, I use this graphic to kind of summarize the existing literature. We can go back into this later on if you want to. But also, you see these two bigger arrows, the changes over time and connections over space on this side, because what many of the existing studies reveal is that a lot of these forces I'm talking about, they have very obvious spatial and temporal dimensions. There are spatial interconnections for example, in the form of seed exchanges through social networks. Like in a refugee context, the social networks link refugees and migrants with host communities, as well as larger transnational diasporic networks. very materially through the exchange of seeds, but also through knowledge exchange about these seeds and so forth. Traditional crops and also traditional growing techniques, they reflect the knowledge and the cultural heritage from people's places and origin, while the new plants and adapted practices represent more these newer connections that refugees formed in transit as well as in their destinations. And the choice of plants and gardening practices is also shaped by people's livelihoods and socio-economic situations, which in turn is influenced by mobility, translocal connections, and also access to market and resources. So there we see this spatiality of various forces and processes going on in the garden. So this highlights this notion that gardens are actually embedded in broader social spatial networks and processes, from the household to local communities to global flows of resources, knowledge, and practices. Had it all in 2004 suggested that gardens can actually be viewed as membranes around webs of connectivity that extend across multiple scales. And of course, there's the spatial dimension, but there's also a clear temporal dimension. There's, of course, seasonal and short-term changes in the garden, mostly because of changing local environmental conditions, resource availability, and so forth. But there are also much more gradual changes in the garden design, practices, and purpose, which, again, reflect these evolving circumstances in people's, and specifically refugees' lives, both individually and more broader socially. These, can include all sorts of changes in people's belief and value systems in exile, their needs and preferences in exile, changes to their cultural heritage, their idea of identity and belonging, their social networks, changes in relationships between refugees, migrants, and host communities, and so forth. So then, with all these temporal, spatial interconnections that we find in the garden, we can really see gardens as these complex, fluid network and dynamic spaces. It's a mouthful, but I think by looking at gardens like that in this networked and dynamic way, we can acknowledge that they really span various spatial and temporal dimensions, and that contributes to layered histories in the garden, and also these layered transformations in the garden. So in this way, gardens actually become reflections of, and with that also lenses into various social, cultural, and economic environmental processes, which unfold again over space and time. And specifically in a refugee and displacement context, this makes gardens really potent sites then to understanding transformations in people's lives and livelihoods in exile. Because, and this is a side note, often in refugee studies, it's been discussed that exile is portrayed as this being stuck in some sort of limbo, where refugees are portrayed as passive victims that are basically in a constant state of exception, confined to one specific location and just stuck indefinitely. But refugee study scholars, they have critiqued this notion of limbo because they say it's misrepresenting these everyday realities that are much more complex, of course, of refugees. They have agency in remaking and negotiating and adapting, sustaining their lives and livelihoods in exile. And there are very clear spatial and temporal dimensions to living in exile, right? They're also refugees in exile, they are mobile, they are connected, they are by no means just isolated in specific spaces, and their lives transform over time. So bringing this existing critique in the refugee studies together with the garden, I really hope or propose to have gardens as these lenses into broader social environmental transformations, and with that then have a more nuanced understanding of spatial and temporal dynamics of exile. So this was now quite a lot of, these were many words about the background and kind of the premise of this research. And I will get to the observations from the field in a second, or in a minute, but I would just quickly like to end this first half of the presentation with my conceptual approach. So basically, we can think about these different forces that I was talking about and these drivers that shape the garden into what it is as sort of spatiotemporal layers that add up over time and that turn the garden into its present form, the way it currently looks. And a great way to think about layers is to think about them through this notion of the palimpsest. For those who have not heard the term, in the literal sense, it means or it refers to a piece of parchment paper that is written on and then erased again, reused, erased again, reused, so earlier writings are still there in certain traces, but then newer writings on top of it, again erased. So it's this metaphor, like in its literal meaning, it's building up these writings on paper, but in this metaphor, it's just meaning that different historical layers build on top of each other, and there's still a little bit remaining from the past, but then again, it also gets, being partially replaced by new current events and so on. So it's actually been adopted, like this term palimpsest, and using it as a metaphor in the social science mainly has been used in quite a few fields. For example, urban and landscape studies to study old city quarters, even rivers, agricultural landscapes, and basically understanding these layered histories of these spaces. And how all sorts of processes have left their marks. As Marvel and Sim point out, basically, by using the palimpsest, we are making sense of the past and the present. And now bringing that to my own research, I felt, and I hadn't seen the palimpsest used in the context of gardens, but I felt it was actually very useful because it really then conceptualizes what I had seen already in my initial field visits, where there are such layered and rich histories of what has happened in the garden. So this is from the paper. I don't need to go into this too much depth, but basically here I conceptualize the garden as this palimpsestic space of interwoven layers, which has both material traces and immaterial traces. Immaterial traces, for example, would be memories and stories. Yeah? Material traces, much more obvious, would be certain layouts in the garden, certain plants that have been growing, that are still existent or not. And then coming back to the first graphic that I showed, how these traces are shaped by external forces. Sorry, that's one. And so this palimpsestic thinking then gives me like a good analytical structure, basically, of how I approach the study. So first, I study the transformations within the garden, and then secondly, I try to understand what these transformations within the garden tell us about transformations beyond the garden, which are then these external forces of all sorts of social, cultural, economic, environment happenings, and so forth, and how these relate to people's livelihoods and lives in exile. Okay, so this is this overall is the conceptual framing. I leave it at that because I really want to get to the field work-based part of this presentation. Let me quickly run you through the method, just to have that clarified. So as I was saying, I had these initial exploratory interviews in 2022, and then in 23, when I came back, I conducted 20 garden visits that would usually last between 45 minutes and 2 hours. And I called them "Show me what you grow" tours. So I really just wanted people to show me what they grow and then tell me also background stories about whatever they showed me, basically. And I also had a few key informant interviews, but then based on all these findings, I basically developed timelines for each garden, where I just temporally put in early plants, later plants, certain seedways, and so on. So for each garden now, I have quite a rich. It's a bit messy, that's why I haven't included it here. But these timelines, and then as I could compare all these timelines, I could really see like overlapping patterns. Certain plants clearly started at a certain time. Certain inputs and so on also started around the same time, and then why, right? So this really raises a lot of questions about why did this change happen at this time. Okay, so this much, and now let's actually get to the Tibetan refugees. So let's quickly locate ourselves. This is Dunderling, my primary field site. All these dots here are Tibetan settlements in India, Nepal, and Bhutan. I divided them by agriculture, handicraft-based, and cluster communities. That's also how the Tibetan government in exile categorizes them. As you can see, all the ones in the south in Karnataka are agriculture-based, including my primary field site. So basically, Dunderling is one of 5 agricultural settlements. You can see them here in Karnataka. Dunderling is the youngest. It was established in 1974 on roughly 3,100 acres of former forest land, which was cleared and then to make space for initially 3,200 Tibetan refugees who are mainly relocated from Sikkim and from Himachal Pradesh. This is a closer look at the settlement. Dunderling's development was supported by both foreign donors as well as Indian agencies, and specifically MyRADA, which is the short form for Mysore Resettlement and Development Agency. It was an agency, a non-profit organization actually, that was founded to oversee this Tibetan rehabilitation in Karnataka. At the time, Karnataka was called Mysore State. That's why it's called Mysore Agency. So MyRADA helped to allocate houses as well as farmland to Tibetans in 22 separate villages, which all together form the settlement. Yeah, here in pink you see these villages, and the settlement boundaries are also shown here in the graphic. And as part of these allocations of land and houses, each household also got a small portion of land right next to the house, which was supposed to be for kitchen gardening. Around 0.2 acres. The initial idea here was that people have access to fresh produce, because at the time they were mainly dependent on rations in the form of rice and pulses, different dal and so on. This integration of fruit and vegetable gardens into Tibetan resettlement had actually already been piloted in other settlements before the establishment of Dunderling. And it was something that the director of MyRADA, of this agency, was very passionate about, as a former employee told me during an interview. So the initial director of MyRADA, he said he was very particular about kitchen gardening. Even in Indian villages, he would ask people, why don't you do any gardening? The idea was that the Tibetans grow minimum amount of food themselves, at least vegetables, so that they wouldn't have to go and buy everything. Also, once the rations eventually finished, right, and then Tibetans had to start buying their own things. The idea was also that they save a bit of money by growing their own food. But even though these spaces were intended for growing vegetables and fruits, people in the initial years actually did not do that. They ended up growing fodder maize, which they also did on the bigger farmlands. So just as an explanation for this picture, this is basically how people's gardens must have looked like in the late 70s and early 80s. Currently, I only found one out of all these gardens that still does that. So this is a current picture, but it's kind of a trace of the past in that sense, because the reason why people didn't engage that much in fruit and vegetable gardening, as MyRADA had envisioned, was that their main focus was to boost their income, and they could sell the maize to the local cooperative to make some money. They also used the maize to make tsampa, the Tibetan staple, and sengong, which is a bit similar to like Nepali dido. But another issue was also that seeds were simply not available. Like MyRADA had left them with very few vegetable seeds, but as I was saying, the settlement was very far away from any other cities. People had extremely limited resources, so there was just no way to get more fruit and vegetable seeds at the time. Also, water was still very scarce, and people also simply didn't have the time to really elaborately garden, because they had to mainly take care of their fields. And they were on the fields from morning to evening, at that time in like collectives basically. So as one respondent told me, for example, when I first arrived in 1975, it was difficult to get vegetable seeds. So the main crops people grew were maize, some papaya, guava, and banana. Another one said, back then we had no money to have a garden. We only grew maize. Later we started growing other vegetables like beans, brinjal, okra, pumpkin, and papaya. So overall, this, at that time, very limited diversity and very basic layout of these gardens, which is really nowhere comparable to what we see today with these very lush and diverse spaces, it reflects this very utilitarian, need-based function, focusing on sustenance and on income, and it highlights these constraints that people were facing at the time, right? Financial, human, physical resources were really scarce. So these initial layers, bringing back in this palimpsestic language, they at the time they were shaped by scarcity and basic needs, but now we don't, apart from this one physical example of this garden, we don't really see them anymore, and but they survive in like immaterial traces, mainly through people's stories, because once you ask them about these times, people of course they still remember these times of shared hardships and so forth. Those memories and stories, they are still existent, which I then call immaterial traces of the palimpsest, right? People eventually then diversified with more fruit and vegetable varieties after they had started to produce their own seeds, because slowly people they already knew partly, or some also learned how to produce their own seeds from harvested crops. They also started exchanging more seeds and saplings among each other and with surrounding Indian communities. We actually have a historic record of a British researcher, Lynn Pullman, who was in Dunderling in 1981 and observed, she said there was very few vegetables, there was some papaya, there were some vegetables, and there was chayote, which we here better know as iskus. And interesting is that Tibetans, they are also call it iskus, which, I mean, it's locally grown in Karnataka, but Kannadigas don't call it iskus. This word that actually traveled with Tibetans from Sikkim, because Tibetans, before moving south, many of them spent almost 10 years in Sikkim, so many of them also have learned Nepali at the time, and they then adopted terms like iskus and brought it to the south, right? Anyway, that was iskus, and yeah, as I said, mainly papaya, as you see in the picture. Papaya was specifically popular because it's really easy to grow and it yields fruit after just 1 year. Whereas slower maturing, fruit trees like coconut and so on they just take much longer, and for people at the time it didn't make sense because they still had this very strong hope of returning to Tibet very quickly. They just thought they would be there a few years and then they return. So as this woman told me, after coming here I thought we would return to Tibet within the next 10 to 15 years. That's why we didn't plant coconut trees, otherwise we would have been enjoying coconuts by now. Another one, actually, oh wait, this got mixed up, but another one, I'll just read it. Nowadays, we are growing avocado. Back then, it was only papaya. People used to say, why should we grow coconuts? Because there's no time to eat them. By the time they're ripe, we are going back to Tibet. So overall, this gradual, addition of certain fruits and vegetables throughout the 1980s highlights the continued role of gardening as mainly, a needs-based type of gardening for short-term food production, as market access was still very limited. But also it reflects the sustained hope of return, right? But simultaneously, it also marks a growing transition towards self-sufficiency among Tibetan refugees. As I was saying initially, they were dependent on rations, on external, donations, and so forth. But these new layers of crop varieties and gardening practice, they also illustrate a shift to, own seed production and also the sharing among communities, which all contributes to this heightened self-sufficiency among Tibetans, right? And yeah, plants like iscus and papaya, which are actually still cultivated today. I mean, this picture is from the current day. I call them like material traces of the early days of Tibetan self-reliance. But they, at the same time, they also embody immaterial traces of culture and linguistic exchanges and adaptation. But as time progressed, people's perceptions of their displacement as short-term gradually changed. Of course, people realized they would probably be there for longer than they initially had hoped. And with that perception, they also changed their perception towards growing more long-term crops. Yeah, so there we have this very direct reflection of how people, this change of thinking, of attitude towards one's exile status is reflected in different crops, very, very visibly and tangibly. Yeah? And at the same time, as this perception changed, also people's livelihood strategies underwent some significant shifts. Basically, what happened was, after the population had significantly increased, like there was really a proper bump in the population in Dunedin and also other Tibetan settlements. That's a general development. The problem was that the farm size, of course, still remained the same. So it was the same amount of land for more people, and Tibetans had no legal means of accessing more land, without any paperwork or very limited, documentation. They couldn't simply buy more land. And so people started searching for new livelihoods and income sources. And one thing that actually still exists today and started in the 1980s is selling winter clothing, and they call it sweater business, among India. So people mainly for 3 months from starting like November to January, February, people would leave the settlements, travel around India, and sell clothing that they first purchased in wholesale in Ludhiana and Punjab. And so this, firstly, it strengthened the income sources of Tibetans, but it also meant that they then became much more mobile, right? Like people really would go to very far places. Like some of my interviews, they would very frequently go to Gujarat, to Bihar, you name it, so all over India. And interestingly, these then evolving seasonal mobilities of people, they are also reflected in people's gardens again. The cultivation of vegetables and flowers began after 1984-85, as this respondent says, because we didn't have access to seeds before that. Around that year, people started traveling for business, which means this winter sweater business year, and they would bring back seeds when they returned. Another one said, I bought only one gerbera in 2 different colors while returning from a business trip to Gujarat. And then it multiplied in huge quantities, so I gave it to other people. So there we see how these seed networks work, how they really reflect these increasing mobilities and connectivities of Tibetans over time, and how they are then expressed in people's gardens. And one very kind of pointed example of this is this thing called kürze in Tibetan. It's Chinese garlic chives. It's actually found in the Himalayan regions, especially Tibetans from the Amdo region of Tibet. They use it to film their momo. And while it's not, I really tried to find out, I asked in every single interview, where did it initially come from? Because it does not grow in Karnataka, it's not native to Karnataka, it must have come from somewhere else, right? I couldn't really make out the initial source as such, but I got many different accounts of people saying that they either brought it from Sikkim, or from visits to Nepal for these business trips, but of course also to visit family and friends in other Tibetan settlements. So these are also these social networks between settlements. And so kürze, this crop, it then spread among the Karnataka settlements. And interestingly, during one visit to a Nepal settlement in Jampaling, it's on the way to Pokhara, there I then heard that they even brought some back to Nepal. So it really is very, multi-directional how this kürze has traveled among Tibetans. And in a way really exemplifies these, quite intense mobilities of people. So these diversifying and improving livelihoods of Tibetans and also their increasing mobilities and networks are then really reflected in this gradual shift from very much need-based gardening that I was previously talking about, to a slow shift to gardening much more as leisure, beautification, which started in the 1990s and really picked up in the 2000s then. So if we fast forward to today, people's gardens have become spaces for relaxation, for self-expression, for enjoyment. They have very little to do with this initial focus on growing maize in the garden to make the last rupee from it. Many gardens now feature all sorts of flowers and ornamental plants. And yeah, people are simply no longer dependent on cultivating their gardens to cover subsistence, so they have focused on very different things. After these continued livelihood diversification processes and also larger waves of out-migration, a lot of the youth has migrated out of the settlements, so there are these days also a lot of pensioners working in these or like maintaining their gardens. They now have the time. A lot of these gardeners, they are retired. They maybe they stop going for sweater business. They are ex-army and so forth, and now they have the time and these material and financial resources to really invest in their gardens and make them these extremely diverse home gardening systems. One of my interlocutors, who is a retired settlement officer staff, mentioned that when we have plants, we don't get bored, it becomes a hobby and a habit. And this is really something that is reflected in a lot of the responses I got about current day gardening. It's a sentiment echoed by many. So as residents continue to invest their time and resources into gardening, the gardens have become increasingly diverse. So they're by no means all looking the same at this point. Yeah, so some people, as this picture shows, they have really focused on creating like very well-maintained landscaped kind of spaces. People even use the word landscaping now. And there's also very thriving exchange of different cuttings, like flower cuttings and so forth between neighbors. And people also, they now have the resources to frequently travel to Mysore, Bangalore 6 hours away, and go to really good nurseries there and get all sorts of new crops that they find interesting. And then it also develops in a trend among neighbors. And a lot of people said, well, I just grow this for show, like literally the term is I grow this for show. Yeah. Others actually, again, they have kind of returned to this focus on food cultivation, but not out of need because everything's available now, but much more because there has now developed distrust in market produce, something we also definitely find here in people's gardening practices, right? There's this notion of everything on the market is full of chemicals, full of pesticides. So people now, they focus on organic gardening. And they also experiment with certain crops that, because it is a hobby, so they grow coffee, black pepper, not to produce it in large quantities, but really just to see if it works or not. So it's also this space of experimentation. So yeah, and now slowly coming to an end. So despite these different developments that some of the gardens have been taking to suit people's different purposes, ideas, intentions, certain features are definitely also common among all gardens, almost all gardens, I would say. Like almost every garden features a juniper or shukba in Tibetan for this. You can make incense from it and then use it in the smoke pujas. Then we find certain fruit trees that still remain from many years ago in almost every garden. We find hibiscus flowers for certain offerings, and aloe vera for mostly medical uses, like against burns, and these garlic chives that I was talking about before. So these shared and unique elements of Journaling's gardens embody their layered histories, again, coming back to the palimpsestic notion, shaped by and shaping broader developments. And I'm almost done. I just want to end by, again, putting the focus on these larger external forces that we see reflected in people's gardens, in the form of changing plant varieties, changing practices and purposes, and I try to give a few examples of these. And what all of these reflect is really, firstly, livelihood diversification, in also de-agrarianisation and socio-economic development among Tibetan refugees. Secondly, a constantly increasing mobility, social networks, and translocal connectivities of refugees, and also changing perceptions of exile and belonging, something I earlier tried to explain, with this initial reluctance of growing long-term crops, but which eventually then changed. I will stop here now because I would also really like to hear reflections and questions and so on. But yeah, I hope I could illustrate, how gardens can be understood as very networked and dynamic spaces that have these different spatial and temporal dimensions to them. And yeah, with that I'll end. Just a quick note, the article, as I said, is still being written, but if you want to read a little more, I did publish a piece in Himal, and I can share the link with anyone that's interested. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hanna. Thank you, Hanna, for such a wonderful presentation, as well as with such a lovely pictures. They were amazing. I would like to read one small sentence from your article. That's really I have never thought the garden in that perspective. Like what we have, it's we all feel like the garden is just a place to relax with the flowers for the religious purpose and this kind of stuff, right? The thing you said, the gardens of Denderlong tell a story of change, of arrival and making a place one's own, of negotiating adaptation and preservation, of learning and exchange, of shifting livelihood and resilience. I think this sentence of yours that I quoted from Himal South Asia speaks your summarized whole article. I think it's really interesting, how people make the garden, also the changes over time, when they had this money and stuff, and when they're well off, and how they see the garden. So this kind of insight is really interesting, how the refugees, they think of the garden, when they have land. Of course, I think not all the refugees has that privilege of having land, right? So this is really interesting. I have a few questions, but I think I will give the floor to the audience. If they have some questions, please. Azul.
Yeah, actually two questions. Regarding the external forces that impact on the transformation, during your research period, did you find any changes in Indian government's local or federal level government's policy on agricultural farming? Let's say the land use or access to the lands for the Tibetan refugees. And my second question is, how did you find the interaction with other Indian farmers regarding the ways career level exchange or providing rental lands to those refugees?
Yeah, these are really, thank you. Should I answer directly or?
Yeah,
okay. These are really relevant, and I was actually thinking about including more of the Indian perspective into the presentation, but it just got a little long, so I was hoping that someone would bring it up. I'll start with, let's start with the first question. Indian government policies, there have definitely been significant changes at a broader level, also some of the agriculture policies. I mean, one thing that actually hasn't changed is the way that land is tenured in these settlements. All of the settlement land was given on a long-term lease basis, and it still is the case, which has actually been a major barrier, maybe not so much to the gardens, but to more the larger scale agriculture activities of Tibetans, because what they are basically lacking is an individual document linked, with their name on it, that even though it's just leased, but at least linking their name to a specific plot of land, because the lease for the land is for the entire land altogether, right? So when it comes to specific Indian government subsidies and schemes and so on, which are actually accessible to Tibetans and have become more and more accessible on paper, they're in practice still very hard to access because of this lack, of individual land tenure, ownership, or any form of, linkage to Tibetans. But again, I would say this is much more for the larger fields. A major change that has also or what the idea was to make things easier for Tibetans was in 2014, there was a new policy by the Indian government for all Tibetans in India, Tibetan rehabilitation policy it's called, which was also meant to make access to subsidies and so forth easier. Another aspect, maybe not directly linked to this, but actually in this policy it was also introduced that Tibetans could legally become Indian citizens, something that, for example, in the Nepal context is not possible for Tibetans. But in practice, again, it's actually much harder. Tibetans cannot just go to an office and apply for citizenship and then get it. And there's another kind of caveat in this, that once actually Tibetans obtain citizenship, they are required to leave these settlements, which then of course leads more to like a scatterization of Tibetans and no longer this living in communities, which is also why the Tibetan government in exile as such is not really promoting Tibetans to become Indians, like by citizenship. But that's just a side note. I would say when it comes to the Indian government factors on the home gardens, I would say it's like Indian government's influence is relatively limited. The major thing really was initially this the agency that I mentioned, Mairada, who pushed for the gardens, who prevented initial knowledge and seeds and inputs and so on. But once that phased out, people were quite on their own. Of course, there are other much more indirect factors. There's one example, what I was saying, that now a lot of people have quite a bit of time to work in, or to not to work, but like tend to these gardens. One very specific and quite important demographic here is ex-army men. As maybe some of you know, Tibetans, they have been and are still recruited for a specific section of the Indian military, the Special Frontier Forces, that are mainly active in the border regions like Ladakh, the Kargil incident and so on. Tibetans played a big role in that. So in these settlements all over India, but also specifically in the south, we now find a lot of retirees from the army who then and they have pensions. So it's actually it's in terms of livelihoods, they're relatively secure. And so they now receive pensions, and quite a bit of their free time goes into these gardens. So there we can see how through this army service, which was of course kind of allowed or by the Indian government, people now have this also time for their gardens, if you want to spin it that far, so there are definitely some indirect developments that we can see here. Much more obvious is this relation between local Indian communities and Tibetan refugees. As I mentioned initially, there were, like in the gardens, we can see there were certain seed exchanges, sapling exchanges. We have accounts from like the early 1980s that Tibetans got some fruit trees like guava and so on from Indians at the time. And now it kind of switched in the larger scheme of things. I mean, it's always hard to generalize, but now it's actually quite interesting that because I asked like, how are these exchange networks currently? And one prevalent pattern that I noticed was that a lot of the Indian neighbors from like surrounding villages come to Tibetans for flowers, because one interesting thing is that Indian gardens are by no means as elaborate and as diverse as Tibetan gardens. It's quite typical. That's also, I think, why it stuck out to me in the beginning when I first went there. I hadn't seen this in Indian villages. These gardens are very specific to Tibetans, right? Again, there are many different reasons for mostly socio-economic, I would say at this point. But so Tibetans now have much more flower diversity, but Indians, in South India, women put flowers in their hair, they use them for puja and so on. So a lot of the Indians that come to Tibetans to ask for flowers. Then some of the produce is also freely shared by Tibetans to Indians. One very specific thing I noticed, I went to an Indian household, and they also had this big juniper tree, which really, I was saying before, it's very specific to Tibetans, using it for smoke puja. And I asked, where did the juniper tree come from? And they said, well, our Tibetan friends gave it to us. We have a very close connection to them because they used to, again, take us to the sweater businesses to Nepal. Again, we have a little of a Nepal connection. So we are now very good friends with them, and they frequently give us things that we now can also put in our garden. Yeah, so it's now, initially it was Indians giving stuff to Tibetans, and now it's, you know, maybe turned around a bit, or at least much more, multi-directional. Generally, I would like to make a note though that generally, since I also look at larger farming patterns, the Indian and Tibetan relation is really interesting to study because at this point, in the way that Indians and Tibetans interact is mainly through farm labor. Tibetans at this point no longer have enough, you know, firstly they have not as much interest anymore in farming. They also simply don't have the resources because of a lot of the younger population has moved out. And so they really rely on Indian farm labor. This is how, like, very regular contact is still being maintained. This is how Tibetans also partly have learned the language. Like, I have met quite a few Tibetans that speak Kannada fluently. It's mainly because field interactions, so there are these, labor-based interactions, I would say. One thing that I really haven't seen is like more like cultural, maybe integration of sorts. Like, there are no intermarriages, you know, these things, they do not take place. There are regular instances of people being invited to each other's weddings and so on, but I would say it ends about there, you know. So when it comes to really like close-knit friendships and family relations, that is not as visible. But other sort of day-to-day friendly relations. Overall, it's a relative, I would say it's very much a conflict-free interaction. Although, and I'm not just talking, but just one last point. Although one thing, of course, that we see as people's, you know, as Tibetan livelihoods have really quite improved and people are less and less dependent on agriculture, of course, that has also led to certain questions by Indian communities if Tibetans still really need these fields, right? Because if Tibetans are not farming as extensively as they used to, then maybe Indian farmers, you know, they want to make a point that maybe then the fields should be given back. So there is some tension, but overall I've seen it as mostly friendly, somewhat distant but friendly relations.
From what you said, I understood that the long-term need for the land is for the whole settlement. So then how does one individual refugee household or a family actually then, what's the calculus for the piece of land that is allocated to an individual family or a household? So that's one. And secondly, you seem to indicate that your dissertation also has a Nepal-related component. What exactly are you doing there?
So how the land was calculated was actually on an individual basis initially. So the whole area was marked, right? And then each person that initially arrived, each person above 18 got something. It's around 0.8 acres. 32 gunta is the local unit, and then as a household, depending, if you're 5 people, that's 5 times 0.8. If you're 4, it's a little less. So then each household would end up with around 3 to 5 acres of field, of farmland. That's how it was calculated. So it was based on what area was available and how many people the settlement was planned for. And then there's a system still in place that, for example, when people permanently leave the settlement, when people die and have no, relatives for inheritance and so on, then the land is being given back and redistributed through the settlement office. So it's a fixed system. The garden is slightly different because the garden land was allocated on a household basis. So no matter if the household has 3 members or 5 members, the garden land, the 0.2 acres, are fixed. Does that answer the question? Okay. Second, Nepal. The larger project that I'm part of in Norway only focused on South India, but then I got a little extra grant, so I was able to do some field work in 2 settlements in Nepal. One is Chero, just south of Marfa, and one is Jampaling on the way to Pokhara. And I chose both of them because also they're agriculture based, and again, my main focus is still agriculture. In Sedok, I was mainly interested in apple cultivation, and among Tibetan refugees, how that is different from apple cultivation among local communities, mostly Thapathali, and how climate change also plays a role in this, because we've seen very, like some major changes in apple cultivation in the so lower to upper Mustang region, and basically how Tibetans are impacted by that. That was one interest, and in Jampaling, just the general understanding of agricultural transitions over time, what role agriculture still plays, certain land conflicts as well, and so forth. Yeah.
But is the Nepal component also part of your dissertation, or is it extra research?
It's gonna. So my dissertation is article based, so it's,
Okay.
it's not a monograph. The first 3 articles that I need to write are not Nepal focused, but this is also currently being turned into another article that's extra.
So, any other questions?
So, countries like Australia and New Zealand have strong policies regarding the exportation of seeds, right? And like in case of the settlement, like you said, like not only gardening seeds, but the consumable seeds crops were also exchanged.
Yeah.
So what has it impacted on the host and indigenous vegetation? Like it must have an impact, right? So like, is there like the seed that has gone extinct, like a crop that is going extinct, or the flowers, like the host, which was like,
Yeah.
what was the changes?
That's an interesting question, for sure. I would say that these gardens, or what I've seen in the gardens, I wouldn't speak of any sort of larger scale extinction on the in the local Indian environments. Introduction of species that are not native, for sure. Like one example that I mentioned was this Chinese. Actually, East Coast grows locally. But it's just the name was, the name was imported. The Chinese garlic chives, they are not local. Then also there was a picture earlier. I'm not sure if I will find it quickly, but there was a Dolle Korsani. This one. This is actually this was brought from Sikkim, and I found other Dolle Korsanis that were brought, or seeds that were brought from Nepal, because this type of chili does not grow locally. But then again, as I was saying, people during their time in Sikkim and other Himalayan border regions, they got accustomed to using Dolle, so people now still like it. So this is another example of something that was brought there. There are a few other things, which is part of this process of culture. Also on the Tibetan and culture preservation, they want to grow stuff that they are familiar with, right? Which of course then also means introducing something new to the area. Again, I hope I'm not wrong, but I wouldn't say that any of these had such a large impact that it really had larger scale negative consequences. And it's also definitely both sided that, for example, this one, this here, this is a certain bean that is very popular among local tribal communities, Indian tribal communities in the area. And this wasn't known to Tibetans until actually some tribal community members gave it to Tibetans just to try. So it's very much, both-sided, the introduction of unfamiliar crops, so to say. I've seen, then again, there are of course also other plants that are not native to the area, but I wouldn't maybe blame Tibetans for the introduction, but it's also mostly we need to look at nurseries and what they sell to people, right? Like now there's really a nursery boom, I guess here too, but also really in the south I've seen nurseries in every village and so forth, and many plants that are initially not from that region, and those are of course, buying certain flowers and so on as a status symbol is also a thing among Indian communities, not just Tibetans, so there's this nursery factor as well. One thing I can mention, which definitely can be criticized, is that many of the gardens, they still have trees like silver oak and eucalyptus, which are not native and in larger scale have done some damage to to the environment, not in the gardens, I would say specifically, but you know, there are entire eucalyptus forests in that area, which definitely, you know, had a negative impact on the local flora and fauna. And these were introduced by certain NGOs that gave these trees to Tibetans as donations, and it wasn't really questioned, you know, if that's a good idea or not. But we see, again, we see the same also in Indian forestry, you know, that Indian government introduced like eucalyptus niligilia, I guess it's called, so that these larger patterns we see. And this one interesting thing about the larger farming thing, when Tibetans first arrived, this maize that is now everywhere, maize was not a thing at all. People at the time, Indians were mainly, sorry, and this one, yeah, this is the one. So now all you see is maize, also among Indians. At the time it was mainly ragi, like different millet varieties and so on, right? And this was really something that not Tibetans as such, but the NGO that helped Tibetans at the time. They wanted Tibetans to grow maize because it was considered, yeah, just an easy to grow crop, good for, you know, good for profit because it's fodder maize. In Tamil Nadu you have big chicken feed, you know, factories. Also, yeah, there are other reasons for it as well, like you can use the husk again for like burning it and so on, so many benefits. But it really led to a long-term landscape transition because now maize is everywhere, and without Tibetans maybe it wouldn't have spread in this way, yeah, so that we can say. Yeah.
Any questions? If not, then in the meantime, I have one question. Because this settlement has been a long process, like it started from 1974 until now, right? And also in the meantime, but regarding the garden, people have on the process like staying in Sikkim for 10 years, and then maybe many people stayed somewhere else and they accumulated their saplings, like Dole Korsani, and brought there. And so many people, like I think there will be youngsters who were born there, and many people who were born in Sikkim, like the one that you said, like it was 10 years old and she had stayed there for more, 45 years old. So in the process of these things, and the garden is also the place, as you say, it's a place for resilience and a kind of like belongingness. So do you think like that sort of space has made them feel home, like maybe that's their new home?
I mean, I definitely think there's an element of that. I don't think a garden alone can make someone feel like they belong, but it definitely can help. And these, yeah, for a lot of people, I mean, just investing so much time on a daily basis, not just time, no, I also mentioned resources and so on, but really your own hands and your time every single day. I mean, this attachment that you then create with the space, no, that's just there. And it is attachment to this local place that's no longer just a refugee settlement, but definitely becomes a place of home. And we can see that these like kind of emotional relations with the space also continue, because in some interviews people brought up how some of their relatives had now moved abroad. You know, there are big movements of Tibetan refugees to the US, Canada, Australia, initially also Switzerland. Yeah, like Tibetans are extremely spread out. And then some of these, you know, inter-family connections, like people were saying, yeah, every day when I call my mom, I have to show, like a mom is in the US, the kid is still there, I have to show her the garden, and the garden is fine, you know, and like she checks on specific plants. And this is not just one example, like I heard this several times. So this attachment to that space definitely continues, yeah.
Especially people moving from the papaya to the coconut, you know, that might be symbolic, but that might be like for food or thing, but that also might be some symbolic, like it's maybe a long-term home for them, or maybe that's a permanent home for some people.
Definitely, I do. I mean, yeah, it's almost, yeah, it's quite a strong image.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, one could interpret too much into it, but I do think that something is there about this, yeah, shifting perception with like a long-term stay, and we do actually see that in some other like refugee studies literature on gardens. You know, you have like in the big refugee settlements in Africa and so on, people also have small garden spaces, And I have read articles where it was mentioned that when people think they only stay a short time, they don't want to spend a lot of their time and energy on these gardens, because what's the point, right? So doing that also definitely shows that maybe you haven't made peace with the fact that you're there, but you definitely have acknowledged the fact that you are at the space for a long time in the future as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's more questions, please. Yeah, maybe one question. Maybe you can explain a bit on what you have when we were talking last time about the resources these settlements have over the other villages. You know, like with the hospitals and things. How I think the Tibetan refugee settlement, it's not what it seems to be from the outside. Whenever we see like a refugee settlement, it doesn't have like things that necessity things that it should have, like hospitals, schools, and kindergarten, right? I think like many other villages in the Karnataka, they don't have that thing.
Yeah.
So
there is definitely I think there's a quite obvious difference between Tibetan settlements, not just this one, but I mean, this one's actually the smallest and youngest one in Karnataka. There are others. One is quite famous. It's called Bailakuppe. It's close to Mysore. It's huge. It's very famous for its monasteries. There are huge Tibetan gompas there. Also has become a very popular tourist site because of that. Yeah. And they are definitely different from what we see in surrounding Indian villages. I mean, one factor is definitely the way that these settlements were set up. I mean, it's not just organically developed village communities like elsewhere, but they were very much, drawn on paper, and things were decided. Like every Tibetan settlement has, or most Tibetan settlements, not the very, very small ones, like the one in most towns are different, but these bigger ones, they have a Western medicine hospital and they have a Tibetan medicine hospital. Each of these settlements has at least one school. They have several kindergartens. The school, again, is people are taught, kids are taught both in Tibetan and Hindi, and also English. So, education is also organized within the settlements. There's a proper settlement office structure with settlement officer, then village chiefs, and so on. Yeah, it's this organized hierarchy as well. Every single Tibetan agriculture settlement has an an agricultural cooperative, which, for example, in this case, he organizes the maize harvest and the sales of it, and so on. And these were all introduced measures that that came from the very beginning. One element was, of course, these like Maidada, the Indian organization, but also, I mean, the Dalai Lama, who at the time was also still the political leader, and his leadership also had a say in how these settlements should be organized, right? So that really distinguishes them from some of the Indian villages, where also generally still see like definitely more poverty, less direct access to facilities. Although it should be noted that facilities like the hospitals in the Tibetan settlements are open to Indians as well, and a lot of Indians use them. So it's not kind of exclusive as such. Tibetan schools maybe less frequently because a lot of subjects are taught in Tibetan, which is less relevant. But even there, I've seen Indian students actually. So yeah.
If there is any questions, then we might take one, and if not, then we can close the session. China.
Can also, of course, contact me by email or anything, right? If there's something.
Maybe if people are interested, you can share your Himal South Asia article.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. This one.
I'll just put it on a slide. There. Oh, please. This one. Yeah, this is from 2023, but yeah, it's way less academic than much more about the actual history of the gardens. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hanna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions. I hope it wasn't.
Thank you so much, Hanna, and thank you, Rukzi, and thank you, Martin Chautari, for giving us
Yeah.
space.
Thank you so much.